I'm Ethan Wells, 20, and for the first time in my life, I'm living alone. This house was my 18th birthday present. A strange one, not a motorcycle, not a computer, but a long abandoned house with a leaky roof. Rotten doors, creaky floorboards, and a backyard that looked like a small jungle. My parents called it a real start. I called it a chance to make something of myself. For 2 years after I got the keys, I lived in dust and mortar. Every weekend, every afternoon after school, and then, every day after I dropped out of college, I fixed every little part of the house, scraping off old paint, changing light bulbs, and reclosing door frames. No one showed me how. I taught myself through YouTube, through mistakes, and through calluses on my hands. Dropping out of college wasn't an easy decision, but it was necessary. Tuition was rising, part-time jobs were uncertain, and the house couldn't wait. I stayed, doing whatever I could. Construction worker, car repair, lawn mowing. Life revolved around 3 things: hammer, wood, and the old, peeling bicycle that was my only means of transportation. The town of Pine Creek, small enough that everyone knew each other by name. And the public library still used a paper card system. Here, you could go a week without hearing a car horn. In the afternoons, old people sat on their porches reading newspapers. Children played tag, and coffee shops played old jazz through small speakers. It was a sunny afternoon. The air dry but pleasant. I sat on the sidewalk in front of my house, bending down to adjust the bicycle chain that had been slipping for days. In the slanting sunlight, sweat dripped from my forehead, leaving blurry streaks on the concrete. "It looks like you're fighting a tough guy." A female voice rang out from the sidewalk, startling me. I looked up. A few feet away from me, a woman stood. She wore a light blue cotton dress and a thin gray cardigan. Her wavy brown hair brushed her shoulders, and her sunglasses were perched on her head. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting a halo around her. She smiled. It wasn't exactly a friendly, social smile, but something intimate, as if she'd stepped out of a familiar old book. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Yeah, my bike chain isn't cooperating today." She chuckled, tilting her head slightly. "If I were younger, I might ask for a ride." I paused for a moment. I wasn't sure if it was a joke or a serious one. But the look in her eyes, both mischievous and calm, was hard to read. "You can now too." I laughed, half joking and half serious. She looked at me for a breath longer. Then she laughed, shaking her head. "Be careful, Ethan. People are always watching you on this street." I paused. "You know my name?" She pointed to the house up the hill. "I live there. I've seen you renovating it for 2 years. Very hard-working." I scratched my head, feeling a little awkward. I guess I haven't had a chance to say hello to anyone." "It's okay." She started to turn away, walking slowly. "It's just that today I decided not to let you live like a ghost anymore." I stood watching until she disappeared around the corner at the beginning of the street. The afternoon wind blew by. Cool. I didn't know her name. I didn't know how old she was. But there was something about the woman that I couldn't ignore, not because of her looks, but because of the way she walked into that afternoon like she belonged there. Gently, and right on time, I bent down to continue working on the bike, but my mind was no longer on the sprocket. 3 days later, on a light Saturday morning, I heard a knock on the door. I was standing in the kitchen, making coffee in an old, recently repaired coffee machine. The house was dark with clouds, but the smell of hot coffee permeated the air. Outside, a light rain was falling, misting the windows. The knock was light but steady, not rushed. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to open the door. She stood there, holding a white cardboard box. No raincoat, just a beige sweater, light jeans, and her damp hair stuck to her cheeks. The sunglasses had been replaced by a warm gaze. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold wind. "Good morning," she smiled softly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No," I said, instinctively stepping back to make room. "Are you okay?" "Rain without an umbrella." "I like the rain." She shrugged. "It's not that far. I just wanted to bring you this." She held up the box. "Donuts. Little place down the main street. You probably haven't had a chance to stop by." I took the box, a little confused. "Thank you, so much." "Clara," she said, as if she had guessed the question. "Clara Morgan, but everyone calls me Clara." I nodded, smiling. "I'm Ethan, Ethan Wells, though you probably know that." I glanced into the kitchen. "Would you like some coffee? I just made it, if you're not in a hurry." She looked up at me for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Okay." We sat at the small kitchen table. 2 cups of hot coffee. The box of donuts open in the middle of the table. The kitchen smelled of old wood and damp. But I'd replaced the floors and fixed the plumbing, so at least things weren't leaking anymore. Clara sipped her coffee, her eyes looking around, not judging, just observing. "This house has potential," she said. "It has a soul that the new house doesn't have." "I think so," I said, "although it drives me crazy sometimes." She laughed. "You live here alone?" I nodded. "I dropped out of college last year. Didn't have enough money to keep going. I came back to fix this house. Do odd jobs all over the place." Clara didn't look surprised or sorry. She just nodded, as if she understood better than I did. "I raised my 2 boys pretty much on my own," she said after a moment. "They're in college in Minnesota. And I'm still here." I looked at her, waiting for more, but Clara just took another sip and smiled. "We're both fixing something, right?" she said. "You and the house. Me and my life." I didn't know how to respond, but I could feel the silence between the 2 strangers beginning to loosen. Clara said she'd lived here for almost 15 years. Her house was under a large oak tree, and if I looked down the slope from my porch, I could see its long shadow in the afternoons. She said it like it was a small thing, but I sensed a connection in her voice, as if she, too, were a fixture of the street. "I grew up elsewhere," she said, "but I've never felt like I belonged anywhere like I do here." I asked why. She shrugged. "Because I got to start over here. After everything seemed over." We sat for almost an hour. The time passed slowly. There were no small talk. No awkwardness. I realized I'd told more than I'd intended. About working part-time at the mechanics. About staying up late to learn how to install light bulbs correctly. About how dropping out of school wasn't a failure but a change of direction, even though no one had taught me to believe that. Clara listened, her brown eyes shining with genuine attention. Not just polite. There was something about the way she leaned toward me. The way she kept her gaze fixed on me. That made me feel less like a tired boy struggling through life, and more like someone being seen. When she stood up, the rain had stopped. The weak sunlight filtered through the trees in the front yard, casting a thin layer of gold on the porch. She set her coffee down on the table and smiled. "I'll bring cinnamon toast next time. That bakery makes them better than donuts." I nodded, smiling slightly. "I'll make better coffee to make it worth it." "It's a deal, Ethan," she said as she reached the door. I stood there, watching her retreat down the slope, feeling as light as if I'd just opened a secret door. From that day on, I began to pay more attention to Clara, though I tried not to show it. I noticed her walking past my house every afternoon, sometimes in a floral dress. Sometimes in jeans and a white shirt. She always carried a canvas duffel bag, perhaps filled with books or vegetables. One day she stopped by the curb, picked up a wildflower, and put it in her hair. I just looked out the window. Didn't call out, didn't say hello, but my chest shook silently every time she disappeared behind the neighbor's fence. One afternoon near the end of the month, I was repainting the front door when Clara stopped. "It reminds me of when I was young," she said, her hand resting lightly on the wooden gate. "I dreamed of having my own house. Planting my own trees, painting my own walls, but then, I married a man who never came home on time." I stopped and looked back at her. Her eyes were distant, but not bitter. "Do you regret it?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, because without those things, I wouldn't have my 2 kids. I wouldn't have this town. I wouldn't have today. And donuts," I added. She laughed. "That's right, and donuts." We didn't say anything else, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was like sitting next to someone where you don't have to explain yourself. Just be there. A week after that coffee, Clara showed up at my front door with a screw-on jar in her hand and a mischievous smile. "Do you know how to open a jar?" she asked, holding the glass jar out to me. "Or at least pretend to be strong for a few seconds?" I smiled, nodding. "I can do both." The lid popped off more easily than I expected. Clara sighed in relief. then shook her head. I hate admitting I'm weak around a jam jar. She didn't leave right away. Instead, she leaned against the fence, holding the open jar, looking out into the distance. Do you feel like you're living in an old movie? Quiet streets, wooden houses, neighbors who know each other by name. Yeah, I said, just missing the soundtrack and the quirky romance plot. Clara laughed. You really don't make me feel old. From that day on, Clara came over more often, sometimes to borrow a screwdriver, sometimes to bring slices of apple pie. She said I should have a taste for the coffee I made. I didn't refuse. In fact, I began to look forward to her unexpected knocks on the door. We both pretended it was random, but I knew, and I was sure she knew, too. One cool afternoon, I was reburying the lavender in the backyard when Clara appeared on the back porch, holding 2 cold sodas. You look like you've won a battle with the dirt. I think I lost, I said, brushing my hands off. He took my shoes. She handed me one, then sat down on the steps, not saying anything for a few minutes. We just sat there, drinking sodas, watching the last rays of sunlight recede behind the trees. I turned. Are you okay coming here? I mean, with people around? Clara looked at me. A thoughtful look crossed her face. And then she shook her head. Ethan, she said softly, I've lived almost 20 years worrying about what people think. I'm tired. Another afternoon, I was wiping down the living room window when I saw Clara standing across the street, carrying a basket of fresh flowers. She caught my eye through the glass, smiled, and held the basket high. A wordless greeting. I walked to the door. For me? No, for myself, but you can help me put it in the vase. I followed her home. Clara's house smelled of dried flowers, old wood, and baked goods. The walls were covered with photos, pictures of her 2 sons at various stages of their lives, toothless smiles, graduations, beach photos. I realized I had never been in a space that held so many memories. It was both warm and alienating, but Clara didn't let me feel out of place. Sit down, she said. You don't look like you've ever had anyone cook for you. I hesitated. I cook for myself. It's not the same, she said, and turned away, smiling. That evening, we ate simple, but rich spaghetti. I helped Clara wash the dishes, wiped the table, and then, when there were only 2 glasses of wine left, we sat on the back porch, under the string lights that strung across the roof. You know, she said, leaning her head on my shoulder for a brief moment. Part of me thinks I shouldn't get too close to you. I was silent, not out of embarrassment, but out of understanding. We both knew this wasn't a relationship this small town would applaud. But I don't want to leave either, she continued, her voice fading into the night. And that's what scares me. I turned, looking into her eyes. I'm not scared. Clara didn't answer, but she took my hand. It started to rain as I read in the living room. A cold wind blew through the unsealed window, blowing a distinct smell of old wood and wet earth into the house. I was about to get up to close the door when I heard the bell. Clara. She stood under the porch, holding a thin coat, her hair a little tousled by the wind. I know it's late, she said, her voice almost muffled by the rain. But, I don't want to sit alone tonight. I smiled and quietly stepped back to make room. She entered, the warm yellow light from the living room lamp illuminating her slightly damp skin and her eyes that were watching me expectantly. I have chicken and mushroom soup, I said. I don't know if that's worth keeping. You really can't keep anyone sad for long. We ate dinner in silence. But it wasn't awkward. The rain fell steadily outside, each drop like a soundtrack. She told me that today was her ex-husband's birthday. Not because she still loved him, but because the memories were still there. I thought I couldn't live without him, she said, looking down at her hands holding a cup of hot tea. Then one day, he left, and I found out I could still breathe. I looked at her, not with pity, but with respect. Clara's strength lay not in the way she walked with her back straight, but in the way she dared to let the cracks in her heart be seen in front of others. You're not broken, I said softly. You're overcome. Clara turned. For a second, something in her gaze changed, softer, more vulnerable. She reached out to touch my wrist. You just called me baby. I stopped breathing for a moment. Then I nodded. Because right now, you're not the older one. You're just the one who needs to be touched, without feeling lost. We stood in the kitchen. Clara took a clean towel and wiped the remaining water from my hair, moving slowly and gently, as if listening to herself. When her hand stopped at my cheek, I said nothing, just placed my hand on the back of hers, holding it still. We didn't kiss right away. We just looked at each other, as if we were both asking, "Are you sure?" And then neither of us needed to answer. Our first kiss was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't eager. It came as a silent promise, that in this old house, on this rainy night, between two scarred souls, there would be a moment that would be kept intact. The bedroom wasn't prepared for anyone but me. The bedsheets still had dried paint stains from the window repairs, and the night light flickered slightly from a loose bulb. But when we entered, no one paid any attention. I took off Clara's coat, placing it carefully on the chair. My hand touched her bare back for the first time. Her skin was warm, her spine quivering as I stroked it. We took our time. Each touch was a question, a listening. Eyes replaced words. Silence became sacred. The awkward gestures weren't shameful, but honest, genuine. When she lay down, pulling me along, I felt like I was no longer a boy with an unfinished dream, but a man experiencing real connection for the first time. Not physically, but with trust. Afterward, we lay together in the quiet darkness. The rain was still falling outside. Clara rested her head on my chest, her hand tracing unconscious circles on my skin. "I thought I'd lost my chance at love again," she whispered, not the burning kind, but the feeling of being really seen, really heard. I didn't know what to say in return, other than a tight hug. "Then let me be that person. At least for tonight," I said softly. She didn't answer, but her hand squeezed mine, an unspoken acceptance. The next morning was clear and cold, as if the rain of the night before had washed away all the dust from the air. Pale sunlight filtered through the bedroom curtains, illuminating Clara's bare shoulders as she slept sideways beside me. Her hair was spread out on the pillow, her breathing even and peaceful. I lay still, watching her in silence, not out of curiosity or admiration, but out of a strange feeling. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wanted to stay. Not just stay in this room, stay in this moment, longer. We didn't talk much that morning. Clara woke up, stretched like a kitten, and smiled when she caught my eye. "I'm sorry I came without warning," she said, her voice hoarse. I just shook my head. "You came just in time." She smiled, a dreamy smile after a long night, as gentle as the scent that lingered on my pillow. We had toast and blueberry jam for breakfast, and strong black coffee. Clara talked about volunteering at the community center that weekend, and I talked about taking on another roofing job near the lake. No one mentioned the night before, but every touch, every glance, was a confirmation that something had changed. From that day on, Clara came to my house more often, without any reason. Some days she would just bring over a few old books, or sit on the porch bench while I was framing the windows. One day I rode my bike by her house and found an apple pie sitting on the doorstep, next to a handwritten note. "Remember to eat it while it's still warm." We didn't have to plan. Each encounter was as natural as the afternoon breeze through the curtains, light, but always there. One night, I showed up at her house with a bag of spaghetti, determined to show off. Clara opened the door in a gray cotton dress, her hair tied back, and a half-teased, half-surprised smile. "Are you trying to win me over with noodles?" "No," I said, "I'm trying to win your heart over with minced garlic." She laughed, hands on hips, and retreated inside. "I'll wait for that." We ate on the back porch, under the yellow string lights. The night breeze was light, crickets chirping. She poured me half a glass of wine, and took a big gulp herself. "You make me feel 28, she said, resting her head on my shoulder. "I'm only 20, I said, "and you make me feel like I'm not alone in that." Clara thought for a moment, then sighed. "Don't you think it's strange? When I was that age, I was changing diapers, and you were still finding your place in the world." I took her hand and squeezed it. "So now we're both in the right place, where we're made over. In our own way." One Sunday morning, Clara pulled me into a small bookstore in the center of town. The space inside was quiet. The smell of old paper mixed with the cinnamon scent of a half-burned scented candle. She showed me her favorite books, an old volume of poetry. A French novel she'd read 3 times. I used to think books were just something you read to kill time. I said, but when I saw the way you touched the spine of a book, I realized I was wrong. Clara turned and looked at me for a long time. There are things you can only understand if you touch them with both hands, she said, and with your heart. One night, after a simple dinner at her house, we had no television on, no music, just the 2 of us, 2 mugs of hot tea, and the soft light of the living room table lamp. Outside, a gentle wind blew through the oak trees, making a soft, rustling sound like the breathing of a town at night. Clara pulled her legs up onto the couch, curling up under a thin blanket. I sat beside her, leaning my head back against the couch, my eyes half closed. Have you ever thought, she said, that you could have a completely different life, just by making one decision? I turned, looking at her cheek in the warm light. Yes, almost every day. I used to dream about going to art school in Seattle, she said, her voice as if she were telling an old story that someone else had lived. But then I met my ex-husband, had a child, and then the dreams became things that had to be folded away. She paused, hesitant. I don't regret being a mother. But sometimes, I do, not for the missed opportunity, but for forgetting that I had a dream. I didn't know what to say, but I knew she didn't need comfort. She just needed to be told. I reached for her hand under the blanket. Hers was cold, but it held me tight. I used to think I had to be someone, with a degree, with a definition, with a destination, but now, I just want to be safe enough to hear other people tell their own stories. Clara chuckled. You're becoming a poet without even knowing it. You're the first poem I understood. From that day on, there was something quiet and deep between us. No need for closeness to renew intimacy. No need for promises, just presence. One time, I caught a slight cold. Not a high fever, not serious, but enough to make me feel sluggish all day. I was about to lie down and rest when the doorbell rang. Clara walked in, holding a paper bag of hot porridge, ginger tea, and cold medicine. The special caretaker is on duty, she said, without waiting for an invitation, placing the items on the kitchen table as if it had always belonged to her. She sat beside me all afternoon, reading out loud, her monotone voice like background music that soothed my head. Occasionally, she would stop and ask, "Are you still listening?" I nodded, though I had fallen asleep without realizing it. When I woke up, I saw her folding the towel to wipe my forehead and covering me with a blanket. When she caught my eyes half open, she just smiled. "Don't worry, I'm still here." We started calling each other, you, and me, when we weren't paying attention. It came naturally. No one asked. It was as if the relationship had slipped beyond the boundaries of friends or neighbors without warning. But we never talked about the future. No one said, "What will we do? Do you think we?" Not because we didn't want to, but because we both knew. What we had was precious not in the commitment, but in every afternoon, every slice of cake, every silent glance together. We chose to love the way the wind blows through the porch, gently. Without obligation, but always returning. One night, when Clara was washing her hands in the kitchen and I was standing by the window looking out at the dark courtyard, she said softly, "If one day you love someone else, younger, more radiant, I won't blame you." I turned around, a little surprised. "Why do you think that?" "Because I was 20 once. I know what that light is like." I walked over, put my hand on her cheek, and forced her to look into my eyes. "You're the light, Clara. You just don't need anyone to see you to shine." That night, we did nothing but lie next to each other. No touching, no reaching out like the other times. But my heart beat steadily under her chest, and her hand still wrapped around mine like a small message. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for seeing me." And I understood that love doesn't always have to start with a confession. Sometimes, it grows from listening, from days when we don't need to say anything and still feel fulfilled. The months that followed continued in a steady stream, but I began to notice a few small changes, not obvious, but enough to make me take notice. Clara was busy. She had extra hours at the bookstore, then joined a weekend reading group at the town library. She spoke to me with enthusiasm, her eyes still bright, but her visits to my house were now more frequent. I had just taken a job with a small construction company. A full-time job, steady, and draining every day. I started waking up at 6 in the morning, coming home late at night, eating simple dinners or sometimes nothing but dry bread and a glass of cold water. We still texted, we still called a few minutes before bed, but something was different. One Sunday afternoon, I had a rare free time. I rode my bike downhill, stopping by Clara's house unannounced. As I stood in front of the gate, I saw her sitting on the porch, laptop on her knees, a cup of tea in her hand. Her eyes were slightly surprised to see me. "Ethan, you're not working?" "Sunday," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "I thought I'd stop by. Bring some crusty bread you like." She smiled, her eyes softening a little. "I'm writing a report for the library. I'm having a meeting with the reading project group in Salem next week. So I might be here for a few days. I didn't know you were so busy." Clara just nodded, then reached out to take the bag of bread. "Thanks, that's thoughtful of you." There was no light touch like usual. No lingering gaze, just a polite, gentle moment, and a little distant. I sat down on the chair next to her. The air was chilly. Clara was still staring at the screen. I looked at her profile, the place that once made me want to reach out and touch her. But now I could only look at it from afar. I got home that night and set my tool bag on the floor without bothering to take off my shoes. The kitchen light was flickering, still not fixed. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the sink, thinking about what Clara had said, "I'll be gone for a few days." Just a few days, but why did it feel like a door was closing softly? The day Clara left for Salem, I stood on the front porch, my hands on the faded railing, watching her disappear behind the low row of houses at the end of the street. She didn't have much luggage, just a handbag and the ash-gray coat I'd seen her wearing the first time she came to my house. She didn't hug me goodbye. We held hands for just a moment, our eyes locked long enough to know that everything was still there. Though neither of us said it, but I also knew, from the silence, that we were entering a different life. One where each of us was ourselves, no longer bound by rainy evenings and hot cups of tea. 3 days wasn't long, but I felt emptier than I thought. I went to work, came home, showered, had dinner. No midday text, no cookies left on the porch. No one answered the door with a joke like, "What are you fixing again, old man?" I left the radio playing in the house, just to fill the silence. When Clara returned, we passed each other on the street. She was standing in front of the bookstore, holding a paperback of The Great Gatsby. "I think this reminds me of you," she said, her voice as light as the early spring sun. "Why?" "Because it's sad, but beautiful." Clara didn't come by that night. I didn't invite her either. It was as if we had agreed wordlessly. Let's hold on to what was once ours, but don't try to hold on to it when time has changed. I still had the key to her house, she never asked for it back. But I didn't go in. I walked past, looked at the warm yellow light in her living room, saw Clara's shadow move behind the curtains, a familiar pose. But now hers alone. A week later, as I was replacing the back porch, Clara texted, "I just made apple pie. Still hot." I read the message, standing still in the sun, hammer in hand. I thought about replying, "I'll come over right away." But in the end, I just typed 3 words. "Is it delicious?" The message, seen, without a reply. And I understood. We were still there, but gradually fading into blurred lines. Not broken, not betrayed, just 2 people stepping out of the season where they used to shelter from the rain together. Light the lamp together, and call each other with very warm words. I know that will not make me forget, but it teaches me a very gentle way to remember. I went to return a book to Clara, an old novel she had lent me. The cover worn, the first page written in purple ink. "Read when it rains." There was no other reason, no excuse needed. I stepped onto her porch as it was getting dark. Yellow light streamed through the windows. Clara opened the door with a light knock. She was wearing an olive green sweater, her hair tied back loosely, looking as peaceful as ever. Only something in her eyes made me pause for a second longer. "I think I should give it back," I said, holding up the book. She took it, gently, as if holding a fragile memory. "Thanks, but you can keep it." "No," I shook my head, "it's always been yours." We sat on the back porch. The big oak tree was still standing, its leaves mostly gone. The seasons were changing, and so were we. Neither of us spoke of what was hanging between us. We made small talk. Clara talked about a new book project. I talked about building a fence for a farm near the lake. At first, it sounded like old friends chatting. But something quietly emerged between each sentence. We were closing in. I thought, I said, my voice low, that we could keep things the same. But life doesn't seem to allow that. Clara looked at me, longer than a heartbeat. I thought so too, she said, but then I realized, the best things don't last. That's why they're memorable. We sat there for a long time. There was nothing but the wind and the occasional creak of the porch wood. I looked up the slope where I could see the silhouette of my house, the house where I had started over. And where I had met her. You know, I said softly, when I first met you, I thought you were just a beautiful, charming woman, but after all, you were the one who taught me what it meant to love without holding on. Clara didn't turn around, but I saw the corners of her eyes curve up. A thin, soft, genuine smile. And you, she replied, are the one who reminded me that I'm still alive, not just to be a mother. Not just to be an adult, but to feel. Clara stood up first. She wrapped her arms around herself as if to keep the warmth of the evening. I remained seated, hands clasped together, not wanting to do anything to break the moment as fragile as morning dew. Maybe it's time, she said softly, for each of us to return to ourselves. I stood up, stepped closer to her, not touching, just close enough to hear her soft breathing, to feel the unspoken regret. I'm afraid, Clara said, her eyes never leaving me. Afraid that one day I'll pass you on the street. And we'll just smile like two people who used to know each other. I slowly raised my hand, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. I don't think that will happen. But if it does, I'll still be the one to make you smile first. When you don't know who you are. Clara tiptoed and kissed me on the cheek. A light touch, but deep to the heart. Not a kiss of beginnings, but of gratitude. Thank you for coming, she said, whispering as if afraid to awaken memories. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly, not wanting to let go, not wanting to say goodbye. But because of that, I knew I had to let go. You asked me if I regretted it. I whispered, I don't regret it, I only regret not meeting you sooner. But maybe, if it had been sooner, we both wouldn't have understood each other enough. We let go of each other as if the wind had just passed by, leaving a light touch on our skin. Clara stepped inside. The door closed softly behind her. Without a sound, I stood on the porch for a long time, then walked down the steps. The night wind was colder than I remembered. On the cobblestone path, dry leaves rustled underfoot, and the pale yellow streetlights seemed to be silently mourning something that no one could keep. I got home, stood in front of the door without opening it right away. I turned around, looking toward her house. The light from the living room still shone through the curtains in a thin strip, like any other night. And I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I had kept my promise, to always remember her not as the older woman down the street, but as the one who made me feel alive, seen, when I didn't know who I was. Years later, I lived in that house for a while longer. Before leaving to start a new journey, I never told anyone about Clara. No need. That relationship didn't belong in words. It lived in memories, in looks, gestures, rainy nights, and hot tea. Sometimes, when I was back in town, cycling past the old street, I looked toward the greenhouse under the oak tree. Even though I couldn't see anyone, I had the feeling that Clara was standing somewhere inside, silently, smiling, and I smiled back. I'm 30, live in a big city, have a steady job at a home design company, get up in the morning, make coffee, read emails, go to work, come home, a steady routine. I have friends, relationships that have come and gone, a few relationships, a few breakups, but none of them know about Clara. And I don't need them to. I still have the same old bike I used years ago. I don't use it often, but sometimes, on cool days, I take it out, dust it off, pump up the tires, and ride it down long roads, as if to remember the feeling of a time when my youth was full of pounding hearts and aimless afternoons. Yesterday, I went back to Pine Creek. The town hasn't changed much. The old grocery store is still there. The small bookstore still has a wooden sign with a handwritten scrawl, "Open when we feel like it." Everything seemed to slow down with a touch. I cycled up the old street, My heart slowed as the shadow of the oak tree came into view, and the faded blue house where Clara had lived. No one stood on the porch. No yellow lights shone out the windows like they used to. But the steps were still there. The wooden railing still cracked slightly where the armrests used to be. Everything was there, just missing the person. I didn't knock, I just stopped at the gate, my hand still on the handlebars. Part of me wanted to see Clara come out, her curly brown hair, her warm eyes, some joke about pies or jam. But the other part of me knew that was something I should keep for memory, not reality. Someone new might be living in that house. Clara might have moved away, or she might still be there, but she'd moved on to a different life, where the memories had softened for me like the old scent in a closed book. And that's okay. I sat on a nearby park bench, the place where we used to eat ice cream together, laughing at a small dog that kept running around our feet. The lake was calm, reflecting the pale afternoon sky. In my jacket pocket, I still kept the folded paper, a note Clara had left next to the ginger tea. It's cold today. Don't forget to wear more clothes. And if you miss me, don't say it, just keep it warm in your heart. I reread that sentence every time I felt vague, not to recall memories, but to remind myself that there are people who come into our lives not to stay, but to teach us how to love properly. I once loved a woman who was almost 2 decades older than me. That had never been something I found strange. Because with her, I didn't need to grow up quickly. Didn't need to prove myself. Didn't need to rush anywhere. We were in a moment that lasted long enough for the heart to remember. I don't know if Clara remembers me clearly. Maybe she left me as a gentle thing among many other things. But I know one thing for sure. I will never forget her. Not because the relationship was so beautiful, but because it happened at the right time, when I didn't know who I was. And she showed me what I could be. On the way out of town, I slowed my bike as I crossed the familiar slope. The wind blew through the old porch, gently shaking the ceramic wind chime that Clara had hung. The sound was the same as before, clear, short, and enough to make my heart clench a little. I smiled, not because I was sad, but because I knew I had lived truly, even if only for a very short time, but long enough to carry it with me for the rest of my life. I didn't look back, because sometimes, the most precious thing is not in holding on, but in passing through, and remembering, just as it was. I never told anyone about Clara, not because I wanted to hide it, but because there were no words right enough to say. It wasn't a long relationship. There was no ring, no picture hanging on the wall, but it was something that made me different, quieter, more real, and more grateful for life. If someone asked me, "Is there anything in the past that makes you smile when you remember it?" I wouldn't have to think long. Just say one name, Clara. Thank you for listening to my story. I'm glad you stayed until the end. Team Daily Unexpected Stories.